this is not taken on more readily, because my postulation that the Israelites were the Hyksos, people don't like it, and they say it's speculative. But Josephus Flavius says that the Israelites were the Hyksos. So in his Against Apion, where he's talking about the Hyksos, he says that the Hyksos are our forefathers. And he says that on 2 occasions within that book. So Josephus Flavius, who's sort of Judaism's greatest historian, was convinced, the same as I am, that the Hyksos were the Israelites. That's why they're both called shepherds. And of course, remember that the Hyksos had an exodus out of Egypt, which is identical in virtually every fashion to the biblical exodus. It's almost exactly the same. So that, the Hyksos exodus, which is earlier, of course, it's not the same date. The Hyksos exodus was circa 1580 BC, and there was, 3 days of darkness. There was a great ash fall, there was a pillar of fire, there was a pillar of smoke, there was a great tsunami when the waters were parted. The Hyksos were circumcised, they had earrings, they had a king of theirs was called Jacob, a Pharaoh Jacobah was one of the Hyksos pharaohs. And they had a war with the Egyptians, and they were kicked out of Egypt, and they went from Pi-Ramesses, and they left Egypt and went to Jerusalem. And on the way, they destroyed Jericho. So it was the Hyksos pharaohs on their exodus out of Egypt that destroyed Jericho. And that's all from real history. That's the history of the Hyksos. And that's not really disputed at all. All I've done in order to get all of those elements together is I've equated the Hyksos exodus with the eruption of Santorini in 1600 BC. So it was the eruption of Santorini which provided the darkness for 3 days, the great ash fall, the tsunami, all of those elements all came from the pillar of fire, the pillar of smoke, all came from the eruption of Santorini. And so, it matches perfectly the Hyksos exodus and the Israelite exodus. They're almost identical in every respect.
Are you alone in making these connections? Because they do seem eminently plausible.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, this has been known about for decades and centuries. But of course, in order to make the connection fully, you have to place the Exodus story 350 years further back in the past. So it actually happened in 1580 BC, not in 1250 BC, which is the standard idea with Ramesses II. But the only connection really with Ramesses is the fact they went from Pi-Ramesses, which was the city of Ramesses up in the Nile Delta. But of course the Hyksos exodus went from Avaris in the Nile Delta. But Avaris is Pi-Ramesses. It's the same city. It just had a different name in those days. Obviously, it wasn't called Pi-Ramesses until Ramesses II came along. So it's the same story, but just 350 odd years earlier. But that equates actually very well with what Manetho says. So Manetho, as you know, Egyptian historian, 3rd century BC, he says that the Hyksos exodus was in, as we know it, the time of Ahmose I, Karmosi and Ahmose in circa 1600 and 1580 BC.
Desire of the beat.
And you can find that when you, even if you do research on the Phoenicians versus the Jews, or you'll come up with the word Hyksos or Assyrians around this same timeline. So I may do a little presentation on that. I don't know. It depends on because of my workload. But if you just Google Phoenicians and the Jews, and look at the timeline from around Apophis the first all the way to Thutmose the third, that's when you will see that was the Jewish people in Kemet at that time.
And he is detailing the Hyksos Exodus at that time, the Great Exodus. And that's the one that Josephus Flavius says that these were our forefathers. He says of these people.
The expulsion of the Hyksos by Noah Weiner, July 19, 2022. After the conclusion of the treaty, they left with their families and chattel, not fewer than 240,000 people, and crossed the desert into Syria. Fearing the Assyrians, who dominated over Asia at that time, they built a city in the country which we now call Judea. It was large enough to contain this great number of men, and was called Jerusalem. Josephus against Apion 1-73-7, quoting Ematheno's Aegyptica. In the second intermediate period, 18th to the 16th century BCE, towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age, the Western Asia Canaanite Hyksos controlled lower northern Egypt. In the 16th century, Akhmos I overthrew the Hyksos and initiated the 18th Dynasty and the new kingdom of Egypt. Recent archaeological discoveries at Tel Habua, also known as Tel El Habua or Tel Huba, a site associated with ancient Tharo, shed new light on Moses' campaign. A datebook entry in the famous Rhine mathematical papyrus notes that Akhmos seized control of the Tharo before laying siege the Hyksos at their capital in Avaris. Excavation at the site, located 2 miles east of the Suez Canal, have uncovered evidence of battle wounds on skeletons discovered in two store administrative structures dating to the Hyksos and New Kingdom occupations. The site showed evidence of burned buildings as well as massive New Kingdom grain silos that would have been able to feed a large number of Egyptian troops. After Akhmos took the city and defeated the Hyksos, he expanded the town and built several nearby forts to protect Egypt's eastern border. Tharo was first discovered in 2003, but until now the excavation only uncovered the New Kingdom military fort and silos. This new discovery confirms a decisive moment in the expulsion of the Hyksos previously known from textual sources. Josephus identifies the Israelite exodus with the expulsion of the Hyksos, shepherd kings. Read more about archaeological evidence for the Israelites in Egypt and new scholarship on the Exodus in our free ebook, Ancient Israel in Egypt and Exodus. The Hyksos are well known from the ancient texts, and their expulsion was recorded in later Egyptian historical narrative. The 3rd century BCE Egyptian historian Ematheno, whose semi-accurate history stand out as valuable resources for cataloging Egyptian kingship, wrote the Hyksos violent entry into Egypt from the north and the founding of their monumental capital at Avaris, a city associated with the famous excavation at Tel Daba. After the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt, Ematheno reports that they wandered the desert before establishing the city of Jerusalem. While Josephus cites Ematheno's history associating the Israelites with the Hyksos, many modern scholars see problems with Ematheno's conflation of the expulsion of the Hyksos and the biblical narrative. Ematheno lived many centuries after these events took place, and he may have combined two different narratives, wittingly or unwittingly, when associating the Hyksos and Israelites. Most of the defeat of the Hyksos occurred centuries before the traditional date of the Exodus. In addition, the basic premise of the Hyksos and Exodus histories differ. The Hyksos were expelled rulers of Egypt, not slaves, and they were forced out, not pursued. The expulsion of the Hyksos may not have been a single event, and many still read Ematheno's text on the Hyksos expulsion as a record of the Israelites' exodus. After the Hyksos were defeated by Apophis, some Hyksos people likely remained in Egypt. Perhaps the subjugated class of the Egyptian queen Hatshepsut, 1489 to 1469 BCE, recorded
It's 11 o'clock.
the banishment of a group of Asiatics from Avaris, the former Hyksos capital. While the second expulsion would still have been centuries before the traditional date of the Exodus, there may exist parallels between these events and the Exodus narrative or the earlier biblical account of Abraham, Sarah, and Lot's own expulsion from Egypt, Genesis 12:19. Alright, so this falls right in line with what Afro was saying in the BIAE and in the nature books. The Jews were the Hyksos, the shepherd kings, the white Assyrians, etc. And they, after they came into Kemet for about a couple hundred years, they worked their way up, and eventually they were kicked out by Thutmose III, who they turned into Moses that left with them, and that's not the case. This is, once again, lies and interpolation. True me to God and peace one time. Alright, this is Hyksos in the Bible Interpretation and Explanation and in Noon Science. Hyksos in the BIAE and in Noon Science by Zane Kochvela Chetnupu. 7 Black Walking Orbs, Planet Stars. Noon Ethiopian year 60, Nupu embryo year 96. January the 17th, 2023. Uyu Tall Kenu Unu Nupu, Black 7, 9 Stool Foundation Power. Mercury hour 8:03 p.m. to 9:12 p.m. represents function, communication, speeches, studying, and learning. Mary Mercury, 8 degrees Capricorn, the bladder, 9 seconds and 2 seconds, first deacon. Who were Esau and Jacob and Jacob's 12 sons? Esau was the Phoenician people who represented the sun god Elyon, also called Zeus, and Jupiter. Jacob was the Jewish people represented the moon god Sin, also called Siva, and Hermes. Remember, all Greek and Roman gods were originally Phoenician Hindu gods. The Jews combined and united all those gods and called them Elohim. The good gods were called Yah, and the evil gods were called Way, because the name Yahweh means good and evil. Yahweh is the same as Jehovah, and Jehovah is the same as Shiva. Shiva same as Siva, Sin. Thoth Hermes is the god that extracted the Caucasian from the Hindu. The Jewish men used the Jewish woman to take advantage of the ruling Phoenicians, and this means plus deception. Esau lost his birthright, heritage, because the dallying opened the way to Jewish invasion of the Phoenician stronghold called Egypt around 2000 BC, and during the next few hundred years is when Jacob, the Jews, stole the birthright of Esau, the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians' religion was based on the 12 signs of the zodiac, and when Jacob stole Esau's heritage in Egypt, the 12 signs of the zodiac became Jacob's sons, through which the Jews received their religion and culture by help of the moon god and the Phoenicians themselves. The whole Caucasian race has shared in that Egyptian heritage of knowledge and riches. Of course, the one who originated Egyptian heritage in the first place was the Ethiopian Egypt. Was the Ethiopian. Egypt is in Africa. Who was Moses by race and religion? Moses was Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were called Hebrew before the Jews adopted the terms. The Phoenicians were not original Egyptians, but a people who had supplanted the Ethiopians of Egypt in much the same way that the Jews, other Greeks, and Romans supplanted the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians originally came from Asia and were invaders of supplanted the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians originally came from Asia and were invaders of Egypt themselves around 3000 BC. Moses was a ruler of Egypt and his title was Thutmose I. He was the beginning of the Moon Dynasty in Egypt around 1600 BC. Moses was an incarnation of the moon god Thoth, also called Sin and Hermes, and his magic wand was the Caduceus. Sinai, the mountain that Moses was supposed to have visited so often, means Mount of Sin, that is the moon. That mount is in the Great Pyramid at Giza. Egypt, the religion of Moses, was pantheism. Moses came to power in Egypt during the time the Jews who were ruling Lower Egypt and started warring with the Egyptians who were ruling Upper Egypt. It will help the reader to understand better if he or she remembers that there were two Egypts, Upper and Lower, during the time of the latter-day pharaohs, the Phoenician pharaohs. A king could rule Upper while another ruled Lower Egypt. This was the case with the Jews and the Egyptians. Since Moses was king of Egypt, why did the Jews take him as their divine leader and hero? After the Jews invaded Egypt around 2000 BC, they ruled Egypt, the Egypt closer to the Mediterranean Sea, for several hundred years. History called these invaders the Hyksos, but the Egyptians called them White Syrians. The title of their king was Poppy, meaning the serpent, around 1600 BC. The Egyptians who were ruling Upper Egypt started feuding with the Jews who were ruling Lower Egypt because Poppy the king and Pharaoh the Jews wanted the Egyptians to destroy a hippopotamus that kept bellowing at night and thereby disturbing his rest. The Egyptians refused, for they believed that certain animals were incarnations of certain gods, and that hippopotamus was one of their sacred animals. Alright, this is called How Hungry Hippos Started a War in Ancient Egypt. This was updated July 31st, 2018. Alright, so this is going to back up what Afro-Uno, aka Amenubi Rakapatau, wrote in the Bible Interpretations excuse me, in 1967 1968. So let's get into the more intricacies of this story. Alright, it says, let me make this a little bigger. In the 17th century BC, a group of Semitic origin took advantage of political divisions to seize power in Egypt. Remember, the Hyksos Jews swarm in to take over that part of Kemet that was closer to the Mediterranean. It was a military invasion. Remember, it was a destabilization from the prior pharaohs, and they took that weakening point when the Phoenicians was going through some issues, and they came in. So this is repeating the same thing. These Levantine lords were called the Hyksos and were longtime residents of ancient Egypt. Remember, they'd been there for like 700 years because they came back through the Mediterranean when they was on those islands after Khufu lifted the immigration ban. Before then, they couldn't even get in Asia because it was a ban. So they were stuck out there in the water from Europe to the Mediterranean. They couldn't get back in. They was blocked. All right. So then it says these Levantine lords were called the Hyksos and were longtime residents of ancient Egypt. had spawned several dynasties and ruled the northern delta. They also ticked off some native Egyptian rulers who established their own many fiefdoms in the south. But it took a Hyksos ruler complaining about noisy hippos to both start a war in ancient Egypt and then unify it once again, rebelling against the Hyksos. In opposition to the Hyksos, a Greek transliteration of the Egyptian Hekahasut, or rulers of foreign lands, in the north, native Egyptians kicked off the so-called 17th dynasty in Thebes, headed by a king named Seqenenre Tao. Scholars can't be sure whether or not he was of royal ancestry, but it's possible he was a descendant of a local noble family. Because remember, we talking about Akhmos the First, because all this stuff spawned from Akhmos the First all the way to Thutmose the Third. The Infall del Hyksos by Herman Vogel. The Hyksos invaders are depicted just after a victorious battle against the Egyptians. Seqenenre married a commoner named Tishri, whose descendants held her in great esteem. Once he ascended the throne of a unified Egypt, her grandson Akhmos included her in a commemorative stele depicting the royal family and called her the wife of the king, the mother of the king. Tishri living forever. Akhmos recalled that Tishri performed great deeds for Egypt by organizing soldiers and dealing with the country's domestic affairs while he was away at war. Tishri and Seqenenre had a son named Seqenenre Tao, the Brave, who grew into a formidable authority. As a regional ruler based in the southern city of Thebes, he fought with the land's purported overlord, the Hyksos Pharaoh Apophis, reigning from his seat of Avaris in the northern delta. A conflict was poised to erupt, but its catalyst was a surprising one: hippos. The Rishi coffin of Pharaoh Seqenenre of the 17th dynasty, second intermediate period, found in Del Ed Bahari Kashet. Apophis and Seqenenre square off. Q. The Quarrel of Apophis and Seqenenre, a tale about a dispute between the two monarchs dating to the 19th dynasty, 700 years later. It details a fabulously fictional conflict between Apophis and Seqenenre. The story goes as follows. Egypt was in misery since it was a land divided. Contrary to the ways of Egyptians who promoted Amun and Re as lords of the pantheon, barbarian Apophis adopted Seth, god of chaos and the desert, the inversion of the Egyptian desire for harmony and order for himself as Lord, and he refused to serve any god that was an entire land except Seth. Remember, Afrunu said that when Cain came back, they was depicted as the third son of Adam, but really this was a rebirth. And when they came back, they wasn't known as Cain anymore. They was known as what? Seth. So this is what we're talking about. And you're talking about the desert and all this stuff like that, because it not only did it represent that they came from little to nothing when you compare the Mediterranean islands in comparison to Africa and Asia, two whole big continents would be considered paradise, which it was to us. But when you look at it from, those little, 40 some islands, I think, in the Mediterranean, that's small. But when you see two big major continents like they had in the Fertile Crescent where the Mediterranean was, it was a great trade route and between Africa and Asia and all of those luxuries. So of course, they was plotting. And it was time for that anyway, for the cycle of season, but just on a mundane level. Alright, it said, contrary to the ways of the Egyptians who promoted Amun and Re as lords of the pantheon. We went through that. Alright, so Apophis started worshiping Set. He was a bad king who upset the land, not because he worshipped Seth, but because he worshipped only Seth and none of the other gods, unbalancing the divine balance as it personified in the ideal pharaoh. Apophis was irritated by his arch rival in the south and decided to rile up Seqenenre further by sending him an inflammatory message. Apophis complained that a bunch of hippos in the Thebes area moaned so loudly that he couldn't sleep at night. The kicker was that Thebes and Avaris are more than 700 miles apart. Apophis likely couldn't hear the hippos, although their roars can reach 115 decibels. This was just a prod to Seqenenre. Alright, this is a call relief of a hippopotamus attacking a crocodile from the tomb of Vizier Meruku. What is that? Excuse me. Mereruka in Saqqara, Egypt. Mereruka served as a vizier during the King Teti's reign in the beginning of the 6th dynasty of Egypt. Were they symbolic hippos? What else might the hippos have symbolized? Perhaps by allowing hippos to roam free, Seqenenre was failing to complete his royal duty. Instead, he was permitting chaos, represented by both the hippos and the Hyksos, to linger. Moreover, he was coexisting with the arch rival rather than fighting and ousting him. Alright, so we see a pharaoh standing on top of a... What is this? The wall relief or fight between Seth and Horus, where Horus, helped by Isis, killed Seth, hippopotamus, temple of Edfu, Egypt. Alternatively, the myth was all about Apophis and his failure to worship Seth properly. As a worshiper of Seth, Apophis shouldn't have tried to muzzle the hippos, who were creatures of Seth. Moreover, Apophis shared a name with a bad snake of the underworld, an enemy of Seth, so Apophis couldn't even worship his own deity properly. So you get a picture of, see Horus, which you know that's Jupiter. And then you got Set is protecting Jupiter as they ride through the bottom half. But we know that these are the human beings that they are incarnated in, and that these represent spirit forces and things and enemies of Horus as an incarnated king. So you have to have protection the same way you have people in this life. You have special people who are born as leaders of different ranks, whether it's spiritual, whatever, and you always got to have a team to protect you spiritually as you move around in this world. So this is not a myth. This is not something that they was writing that was symbolic. You had these people that represent either an individual or a group of people. We know that Seth was a god, but we know there's serpent gods called Set and all that. These are spirit gods, but then these can represent people and stuff like that. That's what all this stuff represent. If you go back and listen to some of the videos I did on, I did a lot of videos breaking down the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It was a beautiful, magnificent series. Go check that out. That explained this a lot too. The theory went that the hippos were rebelling against Apophis because he was a foreigner ruling in place of a rightful pharaoh, an offense to Seth. The same what they doing now, going around usurping other people's lands, especially how they went over there and took Palestine. So it's the same thing. Welcome to the next episode. Seqenenre agreed to obey Apophis, but how exactly was he supposed to implement the order? He was reportedly stupefied for a long time over whether he should actually act on this order and how to do so. He summoned his courtiers and repeated the letters' contents to them. Everyone was equally flummoxed. Unfortunately, the rest of the story is lost. Historically, we do not know that Seqenenre eventually went to war, perhaps against the Hyksos, and likely died in battle. In fact, his mummy contains 5 different head wounds which may have been inflicted by the axes of his enemies. After Seqenenre's death, a man named Kamos, either his brother or son, took up his royal mantle. Kamose erected a fascinating stele at the temple site of Karnaca, and used it to describe his efforts to reunify Egypt. You can't reunify it a lot of times with this case because the Hyksos, they like to take and keep taking and taking stuff from you, as we've seen how they do when people talk about them in this life. Look what they did to Kanye pockets. Look what they did to Nick Cannon's pockets. Look at the contracts that people have been getting robbed in, whether it's movies, music, whatever the case. That look at their business practices. All right, so there's no unification, and it shouldn't be, because people are opposites by nature. In the text, he complained to his officials that Egypt was divided, and he, the rightful king, was forced to coexist with a monarch to his north and a virus and another to the south in Kush. Kamose ranted, no one can be at ease when they are milked by the taxes of the Asiatics. Once again, they call Asiatics because who they come from, the Hindu. And the Hindu lives in what? Asia. So they are the Asiatics. They come from the Hindus who come from the Phoenician. So what we're having here is the Phoenicians who took over from the Ethiopian, us, fighting their own descendants. All right. Kamose ranted, no one can be at ease. Okay, we say that. He said, I shall grapple with him that I might crush his belly, for my desire is to rescue Egypt, which the Asiatics have destroyed. So he's talking about the Hyksos. An early group of Asiatic peoples depicted entering Egypt 1900 BC from the tomb of a 12th dynasty official, Khnumhotep II, under Pharaoh Seqenenre II at Beni Hassan. War, propaganda, and death. His officials tried to mollify Kamose's warlike spirit, but it didn't work. In a propagandistic effort to boost his marital reputation, Kamose detailed how he reportedly destroyed Hyksos cities and pushed farther south to conquer parts of Nubia. He boasted, a virus on the two rivers, I laid it waste without inhabitants. I destroyed their towns and burned their homes to red and ruin heaps forever, because of the destruction they had wrought in the midst of Egypt. They who had allowed themselves to hearken to the call of the Asiatics had forsaken Egypt, their mistress. Kamose's second stele, which records his victory against the Hyksos. The information is right here. Kamose seemingly died during the conflict before he could solidify his conquest, a few of which slipped from Theban hands. Thankfully for him, his nephew or younger brother Akhmos, son of Seqenenre Tao, extended the throne. He consolidated power, retook some of the lands Kamose took and then lost, and ousted the last of the Hyksos, fulfilling his father's vision, hippos or no hippos. Again, Akhmos the first. All right, and so they came back, because remember, they took from Akhmos to Hatshepsut for them to keep pushing. And they was running this thing from like, what, 1600 BC? Until they started losing power around 300 BC. And that's when that's when the Greeks was getting up enough power. And they got Alexander in there like 333 BC. But then the Phoenicians had lost power and start running them from pillar to post. That's why you have to get the Catholic Bible, which has 6 books that they didn't put in the King James. And when you read that, when you read about who they trying to say is the Israelites or the people of God being killed, they use Greeks and Romans in there. And the Greeks,
It's 1 o'clock.
are the ones that was doing all this ripping and running and tearing up the Phoenicians, because they had been conquering, Asia and all this other stuff like that for a few hundred years before they started losing power. And of course they wanted to get back at them. And the Greeks, who was mad at the Romans, who were the Jews, aka the Hyksos, who had all this power they got, wouldn't allow. They start getting back at the Hyksos because of because they wouldn't share all of the knowledge they learned for being in Kemet first for 700 years, and they learned the Memphite theology and all this stuff, and they crafted their religion, which is Judaism, which had a star on it, which it still does, but they went from sun culture to moon culture because the moon cycle was in, so they had to change from the ruling deities, which is Jupiter and Saturn and our sun, because those are suns. So it went from solar worship and rituals and way of life doing it that way to the moon way of doing things, which is Tahuti is the moon god, who's known as Sin and Shiva, and that's why they got a month called the Shivat and all that stuff in their calendars and all that stuff like that. So this was just see if it goes any further. Okay, I think we went through all of that. Okay, cool. So this is just supporting what Afro Unu said. See you on the next one. True me the common peace and water. Here's the gematria. Hyksos is 29. Jewish is 29. A war broke out between the Jews and Egyptians over this disagreement. And during this time Moses came to power in Upper Egypt as Thutmose I. The Jews were getting military help from Asia. Therefore, Thutmose realized that he could not win the war unless the Egyptians got foreign help too. As a result, Moses went to Ethiopia to solicit help, and the Ethiopians responded favorably. It was customary in those days to seal an agreement by taking a mate as a wife or concubine. Hence, it is written that Moses married an Ethiopian woman. Numbers 12, chapter, 1st verse. And this sealed the agreement between Egypt and Ethiopia. Moses' wife, it is written, was called Zipporah, Exodus 18, chapter, 2nd verse. Thutmose defeated Poppy after a hard struggle, but instead of giving the Jews the treatment of aggressors, Thutmose chose to act as a protector for the Jews by treating them like brothers and allowing them to migrate back to Asia with the aid of the Egyptian army. Exodus 12, chapter 38 verse. Moreover, he gave the Jews provisions and supplied them with priests and teachers. Thutmose reacted that way because he was an incarnation of the moon god Sin, same as Thoth and Hermes, Siva, who had extracted the Jews from the Hindu people. Egypt took over all of Western Asia after Thutmose defeated the Jews in Egypt, for Egypt then became a warlike and conquering nation. The foregoing answer is the basis of The foregoing answer is the basis of the Jews' divine exodus from Egypt. Therefore, the Egyptians did not oppress the Jews in Egypt. St. John 8th chapter 33rd verse. It was the Jews oppressing the Egyptians. Was Thutmose I of Egypt Moses the lawgiver? No, the lawgiver was Hammurabi, king of Babylonia, who conquered all of Western Asia around 2100 BC and even went to Europe on his strength and influence. Hammurabi is called Melchizedek in the Bible, Genesis 14 chapter 8 and 19 verses, St. John 8 chapter 56 verse, Hebrews 6 chapter 20 verse, Hebrews 7 chapter. As stated earlier in this booklet, Abraham was Phoenician people and the Jews adopted the name. Stated earlier in this booklet, Abraham was Phoenician people and the Jews adopted the name. The laws of Hammurabi, sometimes called the Code of Hammurabi, were not originally his work, but he developed and established the laws and codes that were originally made by the original Sumerians of Mesopotamia and Babylonia and passed on to peoples of Euphrates and Tigris River. Excuse me. The original Sumerians who originally created the laws were African pygmies. Hammurabi was Bodine, and the Bodine, were a branch of the Phoenician people. Hammurabi Melchizedek was an incarnation of the sun god Marduk, sometimes called Anu and Elyon. Hence, the laws of the Old Testament of the Bible came from the book of Hammurabi, and the story of the divine exodus of the Jews came from the conquering power of Thutmose I. Hammurabi opened the way for more Caucasian immigration from Europe to Asia and even set the stage that led to the Jews' invasion of Egypt. All of this means that the history of the Bible is mainly based on Egyptian and Babylonian histories, cultures, and mythologies. The books of the Old Testament of the Bible were compiled by the Greeks, and the books of the New Testament, were compiled by the Romans. Is biblical history backed up by secular history? Yes and no, and there are several reasons why. One, much of the Bible is based on mythology stories. Two, much of secular history as we in the West know it was falsely written and falsely rewritten for the purpose of setting up Caucasian supremacy. Three, much of the biblical history as we in the West know it was intentionally mistranslated, interpolated, and tampered with to serve the same purpose, Caucasian supremacy. And number four, some of the biblical history does agree with secular history if one knows how to compare the two, that is, if one has enough factual information to compare the two. 5. We must realize that when a people is trying to make themselves look bigger than others, they may take the main characters and heroes of a false or true story in religion and or mythology and build their own story around the heroes and characters. And this means that the story may be greatly changed to suit the purpose of those rewriting it. The location, time it happened, name of characters and heroes, and the real essence of the story itself may be altered. This is why it happened in much of the Bible, Old and New Testament. Is one reason secular and biblical histories are difficult to compare, and in some instances nearly impossible. Intelligent people know by simple reason that if the characters and heroes of the Bible were able to cause masses of people to move from one place to another, change the course of histories, cause upheavals great enough in countries to cause great massacres and even divide the time, then surely those great characters and heroes of the Bible will be found in other histories as well as the Bible. And they are, even if one has to go to the history of mythology, but a person must know where to look and what he or she looking for in order to know when he or she has found it. Bible Interpretation and Explanations, Book 1, letter K through 30, circle 1967 by Amenubi Rakapatah, aka Alpha Uno. From the ending of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament, why is there a time span of 300 or 400 years? As was stated in Booklet 1, the Egyptians and the Jews had a war around 1600 BC, and the Egyptians led by Moses, that is the Pharaoh Thutmose I, defeated the Jews and repatriated them back to Asia with the aid of the Egyptian army. After this event, Egypt became a warlike and conquered nation and took over all Western Asia. Egypt ruled Western Asia with great control until around 600 or 700 BC, then ruled Western Asia with great control until around 600 or 700 BC. Then its rule began to weaken and Caucasians began to gain strength. By 200 or 300 BC, the Caucasians had control of Egyptian territory, including Egypt itself, and they started to suppressing the Egyptian religion, which was pantheism, and persecuting those who maintained it. The Caucasians, Romans, Jews, and other Greeks suppressed the Egyptian religion by taking certain books out of circulation, burning others, forbidding the adherents to practice it, and killing off the Egyptian priests and prophets. St. Matthew 23, chapter 35th verse, who protested and resisted. Zechariah, an Egyptian priest of high rank, was murdered before the end of that suppression. The killing of Jesus was considered the end of pantheism. Therefore, they called the death of Jesus the death of the god Pan, same as Faunus. Pan is the goat god, and Caucasians celebrate December 25th as the birthday of Jesus every year, because Pan, Capricorn of the zodiac, is born every December around that time, and Jesus of 2,000 years ago was considered to be Capricorn, the scapegoat. Bible Interpretation Explanation, Book 2, 17 through 18, 1968. Listen to reason. The Cain offspring of Adam and Eve were not allowed into the Garden of Eden, Africa and Asia, until 1,000 years after Adam and Eve had been banished from that paradise. The descendants of the first groups of Caucasians to migrate from Europe, namely Greece to Africa, also Asia, are called Jews today. And this means that Caucasian Jews have a 1,000-year culture jump on the other members of the Caucasian race. These Caucasian Greeks Jews did learn about natural law and order, and the administration are the same from priests and rulers like Cheops and Khufu, who allowed them to become inhabitants of Africa and excel in the arts and science and the Memphite theology of Egypt. Let me add this right here. When Afro-Unu says that the Cain, offspring of Adam and Eve, which were black Hindus, right, were not allowed into the Garden of Eden, which is African Asia, until after 1,000 years after Adam and Eve had been banished from that paradise. So we going back 6,000 years, and we counting down. So from the year 6,000 to the year 5,000, or you take 1,000 years from 6,000 years ago, put you at 5,000 years ago. This when Khufu was born, and they said that when they came in, right, African Asia, they had a 1,000-year culture jump. What that means is that whatever Kemet had learned from 6,000 years ago to 1,000 years later, which is 5,000 years ago, the Jews or the Greeks had access to what they had learned 1,000 years ahead of the rest of their brethren that was still in the Mediterranean. That's what that means by them having 1,000-year culture jump, because they had access to 1,000 years of knowledge that had been learned from the time that Adam and Eve were kicked out 6,000 years ago, or 4038 BCE. Okay. The letter J, as in Jew, is interchangeable with the letter G, as in Greek. To put it another way, Caucasian Jews were originally Caucasian Greeks, who became Caucasian Hebrews, practitioners of sun culture, meaning the pantheism of what they was worshiping in ancient Kemet was the sun god, and that was whatever the rituals and practices that they were doing, because they was in a hot place. So the culture that they were studying out of all the gods at the top would be sun culture. All right. Before they became religious Jews and organized with their own moon culture called Judaism, because Tahuti is the god of the Caucasian race, and it took him a while to get his culture in there, because Tahuti is a moon deity. All right, so an organizer of their own moon culture called Judaism. The conspiracy to dethrone and depower kings and rulers of Africa and Ethiopian race descent continued with Melchizedek and his general called Abraham, mentioned in the Old Testament of the Caucasian Bible. This conspiracy eventually led to the invasion of Egypt by the Hyksos, Greek Caucasians, and the oppression of Egyptians by these white foreigners from Asia, namely Assyria. Melchizedek was Phoenician by race and also a sun worshipper who conspired with Abram, who was indeed a moon worshipper, and an East Indian by race who paid homage to the moon god Shiva, same as Siva and Sin, be it remember. Introduction to the Nature of Nature, Book 2, pages 132 to 133. All right, so we're going to continue in this next part to confirm this in history. True me to call the peace and water.
That these were our forefathers. He says of these people, they were our forefathers. And then Manetho goes on to describe a second exodus out of Egypt, which happened at the time of the Amarna dynasty of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. So he is actually describing two exodus events, one 1580 BC, the other one, Akhenaten, would have been 1320 BC, 1310 BC, something of that nature. And he describes another exodus at that time. which is the smaller exodus of 80,000 lepers and maimed priests who were kicked out of Egypt. Quite obviously, from the whole of that story, he's talking about the exodus of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. So, slightly different to classical history, he's saying they went on an exodus rather than being killed or whatever in Amarna. But there's no evidence that Akhenaten died in Amarna, that's for sure. You know, he had a tomb there, but the tomb was never finished and it never had any magic bricks in it. So it obviously was never used because they were placed there, you know, during the burial. So there is no evidence for Akhenaten being murdered or killed or dying within Amarna. And it's quite likely that Manetho is correct, and he went on an exodus. He was pushed out of Egypt on a second exodus. And so those are the two exodus events from real history. And I think all the biblical story has done is it's amalgamated those two exodus events. So the early one, 1580, and it's amalgamated with the Amarna exodus in sort of 1320 BC.